I moved into my new apartment at the end of August in 2005. I'd finished university and managed to get myself a decent job. My friend was going to move in with me when they came back to the city, but they had gone home until the end of summer, so I was by myself for the time being. It wasn't a new build but a block of apartments that had been renovated. They'd waited until everyone's lease had been up to fix the place, and now the works were finished, there were only a handful of people moving in. It was nice, spacious enough for 2 people, but was only intended to be temporary, until we could both afford to find our own places, but we had no idea how long that would be. It was a hot night when I moved in, and I didn't bother unpacking. I just lumbered the boxes up the stairs. I didn't have any furniture. I got myself a warm beer, I'd only just turned the fridge back on so nothing was cold yet, and sat down on the bed and sent a few messages on my phone to my parents, my friend who was moving in, and then decided to have an early night. I didn't sleep very well because of the heat, but also because at some point in the night I thought I could hear this noise like a woman crying. I assumed it was just someone outside or next door and went back to sleep. The same noise came back after a couple of days. I would be asleep or close to it and she would start crying again. I could hear it from my bedroom but wasn't sure what direction it was coming from. She wasn't screaming or sobbing really, just crying softly, but loud enough for me to hear through the walls, or wherever it was coming from. Not long after it started, I bumped into the superintendent and asked him who had moved in on either side of my apartment before I knocked on the door, but he told me that nobody was up there yet. In fact, I had the entire floor to myself for at least another 10 days or so. I managed to ignore the noise for about another week, and then it became a nightly thing. I noticed over the course of a few days that it always started at about 3 AM, and I didn't need to be woken up every night at that time when I was about to start a new job. I waited until the weekend, when being up that late didn't matter so much, and decided to investigate. It was the Friday night, and sure enough, when 3 AM came around, I woke up to the sound of crying. I got up and put my undies on. I didn't want to get dressed, it was still too hot. My intention was to find out where it was coming from and knock on in the morning. The superintendent must have been wrong, unless it was coming from the apartment underneath mine, but she didn't seem to be crying loudly enough for the noise to travel so far. I left the bedroom and went into the hallway, where it was noticeably louder but still quite gentle. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the living room, so I went in there and listened. There was no other noise but the crying. My eyes got accustomed to the dark just as my ears zoned in on the sound, and I realised it wasn't coming from the apartments on either side of mine or below, but from just outside the window at the front of the room that opened into the car park. But I was on the 6th floor. There couldn't have been anyone outside the window. I looked up, and against the curtains the streetlights outlined the silhouette of a person against the window, as if they were looking in, from outside my window 6 stories up. I ran back to bed. I didn't dare get up to check it out again, but every night at 3 AM she came back and woke me up, crying out there in the dark. I had to apologise to my friend, but I told him that I couldn't stay in the apartment. He was pretty angry, but at least he didn't cry. Just before I left, I saw the superintendent again, and asked him if he'd ever seen anything spooky, and he said no. But he remembered the old super telling him that a few years before he'd started working there, a young woman had fallen out of a window and died. He couldn't remember which apartment it was now, but he was sure, he said, that it had been on the 6th floor. I've worked on the desk at an old castle in Yorkshire for many years now, and it still manages to creep me out whenever a tourist tells me they've seen the monk. Sometimes they think it's an actor or someone in fancy dress. They'll come by and buy a souvenir and say thanks, and tell me that having someone out there in the robes is a really good touch. Good historical value, a little bit creepy. I get mixed reactions when I tell them that we don't employ anyone to dress up, and if they did see a monk, it certainly wasn't one of our staff. He seems to appear more to kids under 10. I've seen them pointing up at the battlements and asking their parents who the man with the hood is, but they can't see him. When I look up, neither can I. I have seen him once though. I was doing a routine inspection and I came to the bottom of one of the towers where the old dungeon used to be, and when I went past I felt this chill. They're not uncommon cold spots, the castle's a ruin, lots of holes for wind to come blowing around inside, and it's not heated. But this was different, very localised, like walking under an aircon unit. I took a few more steps and looked back, and he was standing there in the doorway, sleeves together so I couldn't see his hands. His hood came down quite low and it was too dark underneath to see a face. All the hairs on my arms stood up. I just turned away and started walking out onto the grass like nothing had happened. I thought if I ignored him he'd go away. I looked back expecting him to have disappeared, but he was still there. He hadn't moved, so I kept walking until I was back in the shop and, hopefully, out of his sight. Cold patches like that and the odd sighting as well as other weird things going on have happened a lot over the years. Not too long ago, we had to get the first aid box out for a woman in her 50s who twisted her ankle coming down the stairs. She managed to get into a taxi to get to the doctor in the end, but she insisted she only fell because someone pushed her from behind. Of course, she was alone on her visit, and the only other people in the grounds were myself and another couple, who I could see were up on top of one of the walls. Only a few days ago, a family was on their way out and going through the shop, and their little boy had already got his souvenir wooden sword, and while his parents were paying up, he was stood in the doorway looking over at the old church. I could see him squinting. As his parents gathered him up and left, I glanced across, but there was nobody there. I heard him saying to his parents on the way out that it was cool they got someone to dress up like that. It made him feel like he was in the old days. Dress up like what? His mum asked. Like that old monk, he said. I live in a small town, and back in the 90s my friends and I had the keys to this old house that was basically abandoned. You used to get the odd one that nobody really cared about when the owner died, and they had no kids to take it on, just like this one. It had belonged to a friend of one of my friend's grandparents, and they were looking after it until someone, the council or whoever, did something with it. So my friend used to borrow the keys so we could all hang out in there. It wasn't a huge place, living room, kitchens and upstairs with 2 bedrooms and a toilet. The electricity didn't work, but somehow the plumbing did, so we could at least flush, although we didn't drink out of the taps just in case. The 4 of us used to do D&D and play tabletop role-playing games in the kitchen because there was a huge dining table in there. It was cool because it was dark, so we could only use candles to see what we were doing. Sometimes the setting made it perfect for ghost stories, and one night, after we'd finished the gaming, we tried to freak each other out with a few tales we half remembered, or, I'm pretty sure, we just made up as we went along. I asked my friend after a while what had happened to the guy who lived in the house, and he said he'd died in one of the bedrooms upstairs. This creeped us all out, but we were having fun with it, so we decided to play a game of hide and seek in the dark. We just left one candle lit in the kitchen so whoever was counted could at least set off searching without falling over something. We had a radio on, just to play background music, and I figured if I was quiet enough, I could just stealthily climb under the big dining room table, and hopefully, the noise of the radio would cover any scrapes or bumps I made. Sure enough, the guy who was counting got to 100 and set off into the hallway, oblivious to me, sitting under the table, convinced I was now a ninja. After a while, I realised all 3 of my friends had drifted back into the kitchen, so I was the only one left to be found. They were joking about it, and all of a sudden came this noise from the ceiling. It was like heavy footsteps walking deliberately across the floor of the room above. One of my friends laughed and said, "Well, John, and that's me, must have got fed up of hiding." I pulled myself out from under the table and said, "Guys, that's not me." At that moment, one of the doors upstairs slammed shut, and the candle we'd left lit blew out. We didn't say anything. We just bolted for the door. My friend didn't even go back to get his radio. We locked up and jumped into my friend's car, and we never, ever went back to that house again.